Hey, good morning, Chandramouli here. Let's discuss about the scope management. We all know that scope means work, and this work is further divided into activities, and the activities are further subdivided into tasks. So the work is different, activities are different, and tasks are different. So here we are discussing scope. So scope means work. So in project life cycle, there are two different types. One is called as predictive approach, predictive life cycle, and another approach is called as adaptive life cycle. Sometimes adaptive life cycle is also called as agile approaches. So when it comes to the scope, right, the fundamental thing what we need is a requirement because we know what work to be done only based on the requirement. So the scope is derived from the requirement. In a predictive life cycle, that is in a traditional project management, the project deliverables are defined very well at the beginning of the project. That means it's almost like a baseline at the beginning of the project. So any changes to the project scope, that is scope baseline, is through the change control process. In a predictive project, the scope baseline for the project is approved version of the project scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary. So when you say scope is scope baseline, that means three documents are baseline, not just one document. Those three documents are number one scope statement, number two WBS, and third one is WBS dictionary. So when you say baseline, it does not mean that it cannot be changed. A baseline can be changed, but it will follow the change control process, right? And the baseline is also used as a basis for comparison. Why we need to baseline? Because we need a planned versus actual. So the planning is taken from the baseline. So that means here we are talking about the scope baseline. So which are all the work that was planned, which are all the work got completed. For that, baseline is necessary. So that comparison in particularly the scope management happens in two process, namely validate scope and control scope particular to the scope management. But whereas any other changes comparison, right, it happens in the multiple other controlling process. So now we need to understand how the scope or work or requirement is taken care in the agile projects. In agile projects, we deliberately spend less time trying to define and agree on the scope in the beginning of the project because it's not possible to define the scope in the beginning of the project. So we'll be concentrating more time establishing the process for its ongoing refinement of the scope. So that is very, very important. So that is why in agile projects we build the prototypes, right? And we have multiple versions. We define the requirements, right? So in an agile process or agile project, the scope is defined and redefined throughout the projects, right? In agile approaches, the requirement is written in a document called as a backlog, right? So that includes the product requirements and user stories. So requirements are in the form of a user stories in agile projects. Requirements or stories are stored in a place called as a backlog. That's very important, right? And we also discussed that it is derived through multiple iterations. So three process, namely collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS are repeated for each iterations in agile projects. So in agile projects, we complete iteration 1, the output is the working software. Again, iteration 2, working software 2, iteration 3, working software 3. Like that, it keeps goes on. So each iteration, in the beginning of the iteration, collect requirement, define scope, and create WBS is maintained, right? And we also need to understand that the validate scope and control process is also repeated for each iterations. That is very, very important. So whereas in the predictive life cycle, what happened actually, validate scope occurs with each and every deliverable. So every deliverable is validated. That is why the output of validate scope process is the accepted deliverable, right? And project scope management. Now, so far we discussed about the scope. Scope management includes the process required to ensure the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. Thank you very much for listening.